to this third running of our Future Teacher session on learning analytics. If you're new to Future Teacher, the page I'm screen sharing at the moment is the same page that you visited to register for the event. So the top there, you can see the registration form. We leave that live until about 3 o'clock because people sign up the last minute. And then you'll see a panel about today's session, a panel about the session topic, some information about us, the host of this session, and then more importantly, a session, a panel for each of our guest speakers today, with links to their presentations. So you'll be able to access that during or after the sessions, and also share the page link with your colleagues. And I'll just copy and paste that into the text chat if I can find the text chat. Okay, I'll paste it in a bit, or perhaps one of my colleagues can paste it in a bit. And then further down the page, you'll find a link to the recording from the previous session. And at some point after today, usually within a few days, we'll upload and make available the recording from today's session. So we're recording as we speak. And then at the end, just towards the end of the session, we'll stop the recording and we have a bit more informal chat for those that want to hang around. You'll also find the resources and recordings from all of the sessions that we've run on this topic previously. And then in the drop-down menu, all of the recordings and sessions from all of the topics that we've run. Towards the end of the session today, we'll post a link to the registration form for the next topic, the next webinar, and we'll summarize what's included in that. Our colleague Lillian, who's on holiday at the moment, would normally undertake to summarize what you all said you wanted to learn when you registered for the webinar. I'm sharing a screen of that now, so I won't read it out line by line, but you know the usual thing: step-by-step guidance, how to approach cultural change, the use of Xerte with XAPI and Google Analytics and so on, latest updates, latest thinking and evidence, how to sell analytics. That's an interesting one. Advice for staff on using learning analytics and so on. You can see, so quite a variation, and I guess some of that reflects the experience of people that are attending the session or hope to attend the session. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Alistair, who I think is going to introduce our first guest speakers of the day.
Indeed, yes, thank you very much. Now, there is, in fact, a blog of the results of the Learning Analytics survey that we sent out a little earlier. So for the 57, I think it was, respondents that we had to that survey on Learning Analytics, we've pulled together your content, and I'll let you know where that is later on in the session. But for now, I'm really pleased to be introducing Thea and Claire from the Open University. The Open University, as many of you know, have been kind of spearheading student support right from the very beginning, and they have the highest proportion of students with declaring disabilities and so on of any university, apart from perhaps an arts-based, film studies, media type-based organization, but loads of experience. So we're going to hear how they have used systems for tracking student performance and some of their ideas for what they want to develop from that into the future. So if you're ready to share, which you are, I can see. Do you want to start? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair. My name's Claire Maguire, and I'm a Senior Lecturer and Assistant Head of the Student Experience Team in the Faculty of Business and Law. And I'll let Thea introduce herself.
And I am Christofea Herodotou. I'm a Professor of Learning Technologies and Social Justice at the Institute of Education and Technology at the Open University. Thank you.
So together, Thea and I have worked for at least the last 7 years on this early alerts indicators dashboard when it was in its infancy and not yet a dashboard. So we've managed to take it from pilots into a dashboard that's available across the whole of the Open University and covers the majority of our modules. So we're going to share with you today how it helps teachers and students, the impact that we've been able to evidence on student outcomes, how our teachers at the Open University have responded to this launch and spread of the Early Alerts Indicators dashboard, and our reflections going forward. So that's what we're going to share with you now. So this dashboard is made up of 2 different data systems, and I am not the expert to explain these, but even I understand them and I'm unable to use them, and they make sense to me. So the dashboard takes student probabilities, which is SPM we call it, and they look at the biodata of all our students and they give it a prediction of how likely the student is to complete and pass the module. So those are looking at the accredited prior learning, individual postcodes, and all that data that you collect, and putting it into a probability that that the teachers can view. Then on top of that, we have what we call the OU Analyzer, and that's the traffic light system. And that's really built up on what the student does when they're on that module, and as they go through that module, how they engage with all the materials, how they engage with the tutorials. So together, those 2 forms of data interact and build up a picture for the teacher of how the student is progressing. And this information is what we like to say is at the fingertips of our teachers, because as a distance learning institution, we don't get to see these students regularly face to face, and we only interact with them on the virtual learning environment. So therefore, as one of our central academics, because our central academics can view this data as well, said he really felt you got up close and personal with the students by using this dashboard. So this is a typical example of a tutor group that an individual AL might be able to see. So it has the names, these are obviously all made up names, and it has the main bit with the circles is the traffic light system. So green means they're doing well, red they're not progressing at the moment so well and may not submit their tutor marked assignment. And then we have a bit more detail in the second area with the predictions and what pass the students may or may not get. We've got to remember we're not putting people into boxes and saying this will happen. We're saying this is a snapshot on with the probabilities at the moment. And again, with the long-term predictions, they are a snapshot at the moment of what's going on for your tutor group as a whole. And then also they have this view when they drill down to each student, so they can see the orange lines are the indicator of the student. So this student's marks, so the bar chart shows the mark in orange of the students' tutor marked assignments results, and then the average for the whole group from the previous year. So it works year on year, building up the probabilities in the statistical systems. So, and again, we have some more information down here. So this is after the student's gone through the whole of that presentation. And as you can see, they actually submitted 1 TMA, tutor marked assignment, but they didn't submit the second. And then they didn't, they scored not so well on the last one they submitted, TMA 3. So that gives the tutor a really good snapshot of each individual student. And I also wanted to share this case study of Know You students. So in summary, we have a very, as pointed out by Alistair, we have a very diverse group. And this one shows how you can be a tutor, and if you're not checking your dashboard regularly and the students going along and submitting their TMAs and doing other activities and engaging in the tutor group forum well, then you may get lulled into that false sense of security that everything will carry on well. But this example sort of shows how a a woman on one of our courses gave birth, and her engagement obviously dropped off the proverbial cliff. And as you can see, week 9, 10, and 11, she didn't engage at all, not surprisingly. And this, when the tutor inquired into this, by using the dashboard, they were able immediately to get in touch with the student and just reach out. Because sometimes, as it says in this little story, you know, different cultures have different expectations of their engagement and do not want to disappoint tutors. So this student was a bit reluctant to share her circumstances. But by being proactive and by engaging with this tool, the tutor was able to spot immediately when engagement dropped off and was able to offer a helping hand to the student to do some extensions, and that student was able to progress through the whole of the course. Halfway, right. I'm just trying to knock on the next slide. So I'll hand over to Thea now.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Claire. I guess one of the main questions our tutors had when we originally started piloting the dashboard is, what are the evidence behind the use of the dashboard? Why should I use it? So for a period of more than 5 years, we've been doing different studies to understand the impact of using the dashboard on student performance. And actually, all of our studies concurred that the more a teacher is using the dashboard, the better the student outcomes are. And this slide is just detailing 3 of the studies we did over the years. The first one showed that 2 factors are predicting student performance, and these are their previous performance and the degree to which their tutors are using the dashboard, showing how important it is for tutors to act upon the insights from the dashboard. The middle study again came from teachers' requests. There was this concern that the ALs or tutors that are performing very well are actually those who are having the students with the good performance. So what we did in this study was to compare student performance the year their tutors had access to the dashboard as opposed to the year before they didn't have any access. And what we got out of it was that the year the AS had access to the dashboard, student performance was significantly better compared to the previous year. And also, we tried to understand the impact of using the dashboard on specific groups of students, specifically students from low socioeconomic status and from BAME backgrounds. And indeed, there we found a great impact on retention of ethnic minority students and increases of the level of 10% when students were actually using the dashboard. So all of the findings are showing that the use of the dashboard can actually have a significant impact on helping students pass their courses. What I want to talk a bit more is our latest study with ALs, with tutors. So what we did was trying to understand the factors that explain the use of the dashboard by tutors at the university. This was actually a survey with closed and open-ended questions. And actually, for the purposes of today's meeting, this talk, we just picked some of the insights. We have published a study at the Learning Analytics conference last year. So if you want to find out more, it's publicly available. So this slide here shows when tutors are actually checking the dashboard. And as you can see from here, is mainly before submitting a tutor mark assignment, after the submission deadline, and in other cases. And I have some examples below the graph. So when they have no contact from a student, or if they hear that the student is struggling. But generally, there is an interest of using it around the TMAs. This figure now is showing which of the features of the dashboards are mostly used by tutors. And as you can see from here, the 3 most popular ones is the module engagement. This is actually the students' clicks on the VLE. The second one is the results of students on their assignments and the predictive scores, how they're going to do in the next assignment. And the last time a student logged in. Overall, though, you can see that nearly all of the features are used to some extent by AL, so they find value in all of the features. Now this graph, there was always this question of whether the prediction, the predictive data in particular, not any other sorts of data, is of use to AELs. And this was coming from the argument that we are AELs, we are tutors, and we know very well our students, so we don't need the predictions. And actually this survey showed that out of the 366 participants we had, 56% said that the predictions confirm what we already know from about our students, but then there was a big percentage, more than 40%, saying that the predictions were actually giving them new insights that they couldn't know about unless they had access to the dashboard, showing the value of those tools to a big percentage of AELs. Here we actually tried to capture the usage of the dashboard across the university. The 42% of the AELs that took part in the study said that they are using the dashboard. The remaining now, they said that they either heard of it for the first time, or they used it and now they stopped, or they haven't used it yet. And to us, this suggests that the university should be doing more to raise awareness of the dashboard and support half of our AELs to start using it. In the next slides, we have some more details about those different groups of AELs, and I think Claire is going to talk through these.
I'll just unmute myself. So the next 3 slides really delve into, and you can look at them post-event, into the reasons why people haven't used the technology. And I think we can really summarize it as when you offer people new ways of working, they can be reluctant to take it on, either through lack of training or lack of awareness, because if you've got a big community to reach out to, again, you've got to really keep repeating your message and selling it. What our ethos is at the Open University with this dashboard is to attract teachers to use it, to sell the benefits. And therefore this final slide really shows the benefits that teachers have found from using the dashboard. And I really like the ethics one, that they thought it would unduly influence them, you know, because it's a predictions, will it make me think something? But actually by using it, they realize that it's actually just an offer of information. And the most important thing is what you do with that information, the reaching out to students. So that is really our key message there. And then these are some of our reflections. The easier you make the technology to access, the better. So again, really good comms and really good navigation to these tools. Having faculty champions, so myself as one has been really positive in pushing it in the Faculty of Business and Law. And obviously there are some other key factors there. And Thea, I don't know if you can just say a couple of
perhaps
points.
just to emphasize the importance of having evidence of impact and how this could actually influence positively the usage and adoption of the dashboard. And of course, the fact that if a university wants to design such a system, they need to think of the kind of data points they have access to and how these could be used to provide those kind of predictions. So I would expect a different set of data points for a campus-based university, for example, as opposed to an online university. Yeah, I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. That is fascinating. We could have given you 12 hours on this because there's so much richness of experience over the years. And the thing that I'm really pleased with is that we've got your slides, we've got your presentation so that people can follow that and have a look at that. There's some questions already in the chat. Sian, do you want to pick out any particular ones? We won't ask you to necessarily answer them now because we'll go quickly on to the next speaker. But if Sian picks out the key things for you to think about, and then you might respond in the chat or in a little bit later when the presentations are finished. So what have we got there, Sian?
Yeah, Claire has responded to a few already. So one of the ones that's come through is, can students see their own traffic lights and indicators? And another one was, are there agreed thresholds in term, from Nikki, that was from Carrie, and from Nikki, are there agreed thresholds in terms of what you are seeing in the data which trigger tutor intervention? those were two questions that came up. I don't know if you want to answer them now or we'll come back to them later.
Well, have a think about those, because what we'll do, I'll go straight into the city experience now. If you want to answer that in the text, or after we've had the 3 presentations, we'll have a space there where we can pick out anything that hasn't been covered. But thanks very much for that, Sian. That's helped to focus there. Unlike the Open University's kind of long-term evolution of student support systems using data analytics and with various research projects going on, City University have been, I think it was 2020, your learning analytics student support project started. So it's going to be a really interesting contrasting study with a university that kind of starts from more or less scratch at implementing a system. So I'm really looking forward to Ethan and Mimi describing what they've got. So if you are ready to go, do you want to share your screens?
Thank you very much. And thanks to the last presenters as well. I think it's going to coincide really nicely with what I'm talking about here. Hopefully you can hear me okay and you can see my screen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
You're away.
I'll start my timer. Thanks for having me. Today's session will be about learning analytics and any practice, any lessons and considerations we've learned along the way in the, I guess, short-term in comparison, but fairly long-term compared to other institutions' time looking at learning analytics. I'm Ethan Henry. I'm the lead educational technologist when it comes to learning analytics at City. So I'm responsible for implementation and training, etc., when it comes to the system. So what I'm going to talk about here today, I won't go into much detail about what learning analytics is. I feel like we have a good feel for that already. I believe this is the 3rd time we've had these sessions. But I will talk a bit more about the project at City. So the background, any principles that we have personally, the parameters we use and considerations I think you need to think about moving forward. And it's interesting that actually Open University using predictors, we use much more descriptive data, and I'll touch upon that too. And then a discussion around impact. So what would happen if we didn't have learning analytics anymore? And how do we evaluate that type of stuff? So a key question to consider as this goes along, and I'll come back to it, is how do we truly measure the impact of learning analytics? We had some great discussion just then from Open University, so I'll touch upon that too. So what is learning analytics? I'll briefly say this. For City University, it's just a place where we can harness data from different sources and put it in one place so that we can all view a student's kind of overview of how they're learning and how they're interacting and engaging with our studies. City use Moodle, which is our VLE. We use grades, which come from our student record system, and we also use attendance, which we get through seats. Now, we use these in kind of different ways and different systems. They're not all aligned perfectly at the moment, not due to JISC, due to just the way that things are in our institution. So what we use is JISC learning analytics when it comes to anything system related. So when City started, we started as a proof of concept. How do we use learning analytics? Could it be something that's helpful for us? Which I'm sure a lot of institutions in the call today are thinking the same thing or had those conversations. But it really took off around COVID-19. So all of our attendance data was in person. We'd scan with cards, which is difficult when COVID-19 happened and there's no in-person teaching anymore. So we had no way of actually understanding whether our students were engaging at all. So we really pushed forward with this VLE grade data that we were getting through JISC. And then that is taken from there. I'll go into a bit more detail about what City do with that, but just some demographic stuff. I think this is always important. Sometimes this goes amiss in these conversations. So we have about 20,000 students, just over, more undergraduate than postgraduate, and that's split between 6 different schools. So a lot of students, obviously. A high percentage of first in the family students, which is really interesting. I found out it was over 50% of our students are the first in their family to go to university, which I was really surprised by, but gives you some context around the type of students who we're trying to support and talk to. So what does it mean for City? Our key focus started around retention and progression. Funnily enough, that's how you get the budget to do these type of projects. But it's changed as time's gone on, and it's become much more around student well-being and mental health, essentially. So instead of always looking at progression stats, it's more looking at how do we triage students to make sure that they get the best possible experience when they're at City. It's always been a key principle of ours to be ethical, so non-punitive measures. People aren't getting in trouble for not engaging. It's just to start a conversation, and that's where you get the key information. When you start speaking to students, then you're going to understand their situations, and then you can triage them to mental health, counselling, student success, any sort of academic help or extenuating circumstances, etc. And in doing that, it's acknowledging that the data you can see is just the visible data you can see. It's not something that should be acted upon in isolation. It's not the full picture, but it gives you an idea, so it points you in the right direction. So the kind of roles that we have, I think, is really important. And I was speaking to Mimi about this yesterday, and having actual dedicated roles was something that was really important for us. So I was full-time on this. It gave me the opportunity to really engage and look at things in a lot of detail and pick apart parameters and really understand where we were. And I think without that, we wouldn't have been able to understand learning analytics to the extent that we did. We also have dedicated student engagement officers, which are in each school. So they deal with any sort of student issues or any engagement, any attendance things that are going on with students. And they are very important, and I'll touch upon that in a moment. We have senior personal tutors and personal tutors. These don't get involved as much at the moment. It's something that we would like in the future, but it was deemed that we didn't want to put too much on these whilst we were still figuring out our personal tutoring process, essentially. It's not something that is too well established at City University compared to other things. Module leaders and department leads, this is more around the curriculum analytics. So some of the stuff that was touched upon in the previous talk, this is stuff around seeing your own modules. How can you learn from the data that you're seeing in the engagement there? So these have been really important roles as well. And then associate deans, obviously giving a bigger picture when it comes to learning. So when it comes to these processes, the engagement data that we have, and I'll touch upon what that means, essentially that is generated into reports that we put together. And we send these to the engagement officers in each one of the schools every week. Now, it is up to those schools how often they act upon that data. There is only about one engagement officer in each school and potentially 5,000 students, give or take, for that one individual. So obviously it's a lot of work for that one individual to try and pick who the priorities are in terms of the engagement stats. Now, sometimes in some schools, they will triage this student directly from the conversations. And in other schools, they will then pass that information on to a senior personal tutor or a personal tutor who will take it from there and start discussions with the student around how they can help and how they can support that student moving forward. So in terms of the engagement data, this is a slice of what it looks like. So we use JISC, which has an interface, but we haven't been using the interface on the sheer basis that we had a thought around the parameters that we wanted to change, and we couldn't quite be creative enough in the system. And also our attendance data was a bit iffy. So we wanted to pull that out and be able to put that in when we wanted and when we didn't want. So what we were doing is we were providing these engagement reports, and every week they would have a slice of what we see here. This would be your online engagement. You'd be able to see your attendance and your grades being part of the online engagement as well. And okay, halfway through, perfect. And then we would send these to the engagement officers, and each week they would either reach out to the students who are deemed as red, or they would wait another week and then target students who've been red for multiple weeks, for example. And that was it differs between different schools, and I think there's a lot of reasoning on all parts there. I think SHPS, which is our health school, we're a bit more on it every week than other schools, but that's natural because they have a strong personal tutoring system, etc. as well. So what kind of parameters do we use? So essentially what we're looking at is the Moodle data, VLE usage. So we look at everything from a modular perspective and we take it up from there. So everything's calculated first and foremost on a module level. So we look at last activity. Have they logged into their modules over the last week or 2 weeks? If they haven't, then they're either amber or red based upon that. And what is their usage of resources compared to the average student on that cohort for that module? And I'll touch upon why that's important to consider in a moment. We also look at attendance. So anything below 25% attendance, you start getting flagged as red, and anything above 70%, you're green, anything in between, amber. And then finally, grades. So if you're failing, which is 40% in most of the schools, you're red, 60, so 2-1 and above, you're green, and then anything in between, amber again. And this builds up to give you an idea of each module, and then that is summarized in a course level RAG status. So considerations that are really important when it comes to this engagement and parameters. What are you trying to achieve and why? So are you looking at well-being? Are you looking at progression? These type of things dictate what you're looking at in terms of parameters. I mean, it's really important to consider those things. For example, some of our schools use the library a lot, and other schools don't at all. So if we were thinking about what's most relevant to students, maybe library data isn't something that we would use for all students. It might just be a parameter that we use for certain schools, for example. Is it easy to explain and justify your choices? From my experience of sitting down with associate deans and lecturers and even students, if you can't explain how you came to your calculations, you lose them. You lose them very quickly. So that was something that was really important for us to be able to fully understand our data and understand how we can communicate that data and those parameters around that. There's also something that we learned around processes around gaps in data. So when there's read-in weeks, or if there's strikes, which we had a lot of over the last couple of years, what do you do in your process? Some of our data kind of fell apart, and students would become red for attendance automatically just because there was no sessions over that time. So it's about building kind of reasonings and processes that you can do just in case those things do happen. Some lessons we also learned as well: calculating things at a modular level is really important, in my opinion. There's no point comparing how people are engaging on their VLE from nursing compared to engineering. I mean, there's not much consistency between modules at the best of times, but trying to compare school level students, it doesn't really work. It's much better if you compare students from their very modular level. Don't let student flagging overly dictate. So we have about 20% of students read at any given time, maybe a bit less. And we played around with some of these parameters and we got it to less. But really what you want to dictate is, how do you define engagement first and foremost? If there's more students who are not engaging by your own definitions, you can look at your definitions, but if you're happy with them, then it just means that not enough students are engaging. So you might need to offer more support. And that's the key kind of take home with that. Involving students and tutors and academics at every decision you make is really key as well. They understand what they do in terms of students every day, and the academics understand what's important for their courses. So that's really important. And it helps you to truly understand the data, which is obviously something that is key when it comes to this. So what if City no longer had learning analytics? We have a duty of care for our students. If we didn't have attendance and we didn't have any VLE activity engagement, I think we'd be in trouble in terms of understanding our students. And we feel that we have that duty of care to actually understand them and to provide the support based on the back of that. We'd also have no improvements based on modules. So I haven't talked too much about this. Obviously, 12 minutes, you can't talk about everything. But we also look at kind of curricular analytics. So looking at themes and how do you see the trends in people's engagement and their learning, and how do you change that based upon that data? We'd lose any activity based on that and any decisions around that. And of course, there's potential legal issues there. We've had some tragedies in the past, and potentially you can spot those sooner. And if we didn't, then that can obviously come back to bite the university, and it's not something that we want to be involved in for moral reasons, let alone legal reasons. And finally, evaluation and analysis. This is something that's really important to us. And how do you truly measure the impact of learning analytics? Now, we've heard some stuff that Open University have talked about. I can't wait to read those articles, because I think it's some great work that's gone on there. When it comes to the work that we do, where there's a much more of a push around well-being than progression, it becomes a bit harder to kind of define and understand that. You can look at progression rates, and you can look at the grades of people who were flagged as red potentially, and was there changes in their student journey? That's some interesting research I'd like to take part in. You can look at student satisfaction, NSF scores, module feedback, and surveys. But again, you don't quite narrow it down enough unless you're looking at specific research. Number of students being passed over to student services. So this is something we'd like to do. Has there been an increase? There has been. But is this due to triaging? Is this due to noticing students who need that support? As long as you're actually helping that student and triaging them for the right reasons, as opposed to just sending them to counselling when they don't need it. But to do that, there's a need for documentation. We don't have a case management system at the moment. It's something that we're working on at City. So being able to document this stuff is really key when it comes to looking at impact. And maybe even something more granular, some research that goes on when you speak to people and cross-departmental research. This is the final slide. I know I'm probably out of time. We want to look more at impact, curriculum analytics, and looking at trends in data. These are some screenshots that I've put together and Jiska put together in understanding where students are on their journey, or where cohorts are on their journey, and what leads to success, and how can we promote that moving forward. And that's everything for me.
And you're not out of time. That was bang on time. So thank you very much for that. Sian, do we have any specific questions that Ethan and Mimi should be thinking about?
There's been a few questions. There's obviously feedback in the chat, people liking kind of overall approach of the emphasis on depth of understanding of metrics rather than data for data's sake. And then some questions about from Jed about, are you using VLE engagement data to develop the curriculum? And also a question from Jed as well, who might want to come on mic after when we get to the open mic bit at the end. Why not use Mailer as well to show comms engagement? Jed can elaborate on that question maybe later on.
Yeah.
But those are the questions so far.
Great. So smashing. So we got some things.
There's a couple of others that are coming in now.
There will be, and that's all great, and that's one of the things we love about this format, that the questions can carry on in the background. But in terms of getting the presentations moving forward, thank you very much for that, and loads of good stuff there that people are picking up on. And we've got a very different approach now for our final presentation, because up to now we've been looking at almost the macro scale learning analytics embedded across an institution with data being collected in all sorts of ways from all sorts of systems. What we're going to hear about now is almost micro scale learning analytics, where the learning analytics is embedded within the resources that the students are using. So I'm really looking forward to our final session, where Zachary and Zara will be talking about what they've been doing with the Xerte online toolkits at the University of York. So over to you, Zach.
Yeah, that is a really good way to describe it. So Zach and I are final year chemistry students at the University of York, and we'll be presenting here our findings on our BSc projects, which were regarding adaptive e-learning in teaching laboratories. What we've done here is very much a smaller scale than what you've just seen, but we thought it might be nice for you to get more of a student perspective and more of an intricate look at the learning analytics that students might be doing. So Zach, if you can put the next slide on, thank you. So first, I'll take you through a little bit of the context of what we did. So adaptive e-learning essentially is wanting to provide students with personalized learning experiences based on their personal traits. Now, it does this by changing the content, presentation, and navigation of online learning materials. Essentially, this means that each student is provided with a tailored learning experience. Now, the two key facets of adaptive e-learning are the instant tailored feedback that students will get, as well as the ability to track user behavior within the e-learning environment. Now, in terms of previous studies in this area, unfortunately, there is a major focus on the design of these tools rather than evaluating their effects on learning outcomes. However, their general consensus does seem to be that adaptive e-learning leads to positive learning outcomes, and this has been seen across a range of disciplines. Indeed, some efficacy has been shown in terms of chemical education, which is what me and Zach were really quite interested in as chemistry students ourselves. However, in terms of education in laboratories, the research is very lacking. So this then brings us to the aims of our study, which was to design a pre-laboratory adaptive tutorial and evaluate its effects on learning outcomes for first-year chemistry students here at the University of York in teaching laboratories. So we decided to use Xerte to create our tool, and I suppose that's why we were invited here today to talk about what we did. Now, the learning content that we needed students to learn prior to attending their lab day was divided into 4 subsections, and these would be sequentially delivered to students as they completed the tutorial. Now, in total, it took 16 hours to create the adaptive tutorial. We made a total of 54 pages, 20 of which were part of the compulsory path with every student engaging with these pages, and 34 were part of adaptive pathways, which would only be given to students if their user inputs deemed it would be necessary to do so. Now, the cool thing about what we did is that there are actually over 2,000 unique ways that a student could be taken through the tutorial, depending on the adaptive pathways that the system gave them. So a total of 193 students here at the university were required to complete this adaptive tutorial prior to attending their lab day. Now, finally, before I hand over to Zach, I just want to quickly explain why we should care and why we decided to undertake this research. Well, the hope really was that we could use the findings of our study to sort of recommend how to teaching laboratories instructors, how they could implement adaptive e-learning as a way to really support diverse student cohorts, obviously with university cohorts becoming increasingly larger and more diverse in the modern age, this is really something that we thought would be a good idea to look into. So now I'll hand you over to Zach.
Thanks, Zara. So I'm going to take you guys through the results we got from our XAPI and kind of a bit about student opinion in terms of how they felt about doing it. So to do that, I think the best thing to start with is to take you guys through an example of how a topic in our tutorial might work. And this is a kind of a little flowchart that I'm going to break down for you to show you how it kind of all went down. So this is what we call the main pathway, and this is the compulsory bit. You can see here we've used Xerti to create this kind of flow through this. They start with kind of a briefing, often using our lab briefing videos that we have at York. They're then probed with a question. Optionally, they can engage with a technique video, which just shows them how to do a specific lab task that we're talking about. And then they move on. And the part that becomes adaptive is if they get that first question wrong, where they join what we call adaptive pathway 1. This is really about reinforcing students' understanding, often coming at things maybe from a slightly different angle, maybe with diagrams, things like that, to help them build their confidence in the topic before we probe them with another question. If they get that right, they're free to move on. If they get it wrong, they engage with what we call adaptive pathway 2. Again, all about reinforcing what students might already know, often maybe coming at it with a video, a bit more of an in-depth description of what's going on to really help them understand before checking they've really understood it with a final question. And from there, all students move on. So how many interactions did we get then? Well, from the 193 students that engaged, 3.6% did not complete our adaptive tutorial and did not attend the lab day. That left us with 183 completions of the adaptive tutorial. And of those, 49 students chose to engage with our anonymous Google survey about what they'd done. That's about 26.3% of them. Can't seem to move on. There we go. In terms of this, within the AT, this is the data from the XAPI, which was connected to a SCORM cloud. And that spat out a lot of data for us. It's not quite perfect. So this is more about proportions because it didn't quite track everyone. But in terms of proportions, we had about 132 engagements on average with any page on the main pathway, 28 engagements on average with a page on adaptive pathway 1, and around about 6 engagements with the average page on adaptive pathway 2. So when we break this down by question, it becomes a lot more interesting. You see, from this, educators can really see where students are struggling. In our case, it was the use of C-Light, workups, and rotary evaporation. Now, the use of C-Light is a technique that was totally new to all the students in this task, so we expected students to struggle. But it's things like workups and rotary evaporation were areas that students had encountered several times before and should have been really familiar with. They've had previous teaching on it. So this is where educators can really use content like this to understand where students might need a bit more additional support and where we can implement additional teaching. From this, we can also learn that our adaptive pathways did seem to improve student understanding. This is based on a t-test comparing the average number of engagements with adaptive pathway 1 and whether that was followed with engagements with adaptive pathway 2. And we can also learn that student engagement appears to drop as they move through the tutorial. This is kind of a difficult thing to talk about because we did have a lot of data mismatch with this, and we're going to dive into a bit more depth with it later on in the presentation. So in terms of student opinion then, we asked students in our anonymous Google survey if they felt the adaptive tutorial was a valuable learning tool. About 69% of them agreed with this. We had fairly good agreement overall, and it was statistically significant. So it was interesting to see that students really did enjoy using this, enjoy engaging with it, and find it helped their understanding of the topic. In terms of whether they wanted to do more in the future, again, over 60% of them agreeing with this, fairly strong agreement overall and statistically significant, but I should note, slightly less strong agreement than the previous statement and slightly less confidence with our significance. So a kind of idea here that students think that adaptive tutorials could really be valuable to their understanding, but perhaps not in this context, perhaps not in the way that we've performed it. So we also gave students the opportunity to give us some long answer responses. So we asked them what they liked about doing the adaptive tutorial. A good proportion of students really felt that it improved their understanding compared to what they're usually given. And lots of them saying they felt it was much more engaging, especially using those active learning techniques, like use of questions to help them build that understanding. And we also had a good proportion of students saying that they liked the fact there was a lot more detail. So a drive here from students to control their learning almost and engage with what they want to and learn as much as they want to learn. In terms of what they didn't like, a good proportion said the task was a bit too long, and we weren't super surprised to see this. Usually, pre-lab content takes 10 to 12 minutes. This took them around about half an hour to engage with, so that's what, 2.3 times longer. So we weren't too surprised to see some students saying that it was a bit too long. In terms of some of the content, they did have problems with little bits of it. Often they felt issues with questions that asked them to rank things in order or put like steps in order. They really didn't like that kind of question. Some of them also did note that some of the feedback wasn't as good as it potentially could have been. We weren't super surprised to see this. It's an issue that often comes up with the literature. And it's really, I reckon, because it's hard to know where a student's going to go wrong, and it's hard to design something that's going to respond exactly how we need it to. There was also a couple students saying they had issues with the restrictive nature of the program. We're going to dive into a bit more about what we think they were talking about later in this presentation, but we'd have to do a bit more research to really understand what they didn't like. So in terms of how they'd feel about doing more in the future, about 3/4 had a positive opinion of doing this, and about 20% of them said they wanted a change or two to be implemented before they did, but we'd need more research to understand what changes they'd want. But again, really reinforcing that students do seem to want to engage with material like this. So in terms of those conflicting results I mentioned earlier, we had 3 ways of measuring how many students engaged with our content. We had the XAPI, which, like I said, gave us 74% of students completing this tutorial, totally in line with wider literature, quite expected. We had our pre-lab Google form, which was included at the very end of the adaptive tutorial. Our students were required to complete this before they would be able to attend labs. And that was saying that 97% completed the tutorial. And then we also had our anonymous questionnaire, which said that 94% of students completed the tutorial. So a lot of disagreement here between all of these. And I think it's one of those things that we'd really have to do more research to understand what's going on and whether the XAPI is correct or if our questionnaires are more accurate. And I think it'd be interesting to find out whether the lack of potential engagement and drop-off is because of the use of an AT, or if it's simply how it always is. Over to you, Zara.
We're going to talk a little bit now about some of the key takeaways that we took from the research. Now, I should just mention that some of the supporting information is not included here, but it will be available, I believe, on the Future Teacher website if you would like to have a look. So firstly, from the surveys, there were 3 main takeaways. The first being that students generally engaged really well with our adaptive tutorial. We saw a lot of active participation and use of feedback. The second takeaway here is that most students displayed a really positive learning attitude towards the tutorial. As Zach mentioned previously, students were willing to use the type of resource again, which was really promising. And finally, overall, students perceived very high laboratory satisfaction after having used this adaptive tutorial, where generally we saw much more confident and knowledgeable learners in the laboratory, which is exactly what we'd hoped for. Now, in terms of the relationship between students' engagement, attitude, and outcomes in labs, we again found 3 main takeaways here. The first being that students who actively participated in their learning within the adaptive tutorial seemed more likely to have a successful lab session after the fact. And similarly, students who had a positive learning attitude towards the tutorial were also more likely to show success in the lab. And the final takeaway here is that active engagement within our tutorial and positive attitude towards it were more likely to occur together than to occur separately. So that was quite interesting. So now we'll take a look at demographic differences in how students made use of the tutorial and what they got from it. So firstly, I should mention that there were no significant differences between genders, ethnicities, or sexual identities. However, there were 2 interesting findings here. The first is that students with English as their first language actually had significantly lower attitude scores compared to non-native English speakers. And secondly, students who identified as disabled had much lower engagement than students who did not identify as disabled. So we weren't exactly sure what caused that. That might be something that future research could probe, but those were two interesting findings in that regard. Have we gone over in time?
I think we
I
may
just
have.
ask.
Yeah, if you could sort of wrap up in 30 seconds or so, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
so
fine.
really briefly, just to outline why we might not have done wider studies on this. We didn't have any control group for ethical reasons, just because of timing.
Mhm.
We only had 4 weeks, I think, to do this, so we couldn't make more than one to probe different lab days and things like that to understand. And then in terms of some of the problems we had with Xerte, we had, though it was really good and really useful, some of the tracking was a little bit dodgy for us. Some of the things saying we had 319 users, but there's only 193 students. And some of those interactions not quite coming up properly for us. So that's pretty much it. Thank you guys for listening.
I would love to have given you loads of extra time, but we do have time in the discussion bit now. And if you're able to stay on after 2, people tend to hang on for another 10 minutes or so to go into the details. I would definitely remind people to go and have a look at the full presentation, and I do apologise for all our presenters. We would love to have given everybody half an hour, but then it would have been a half hour, hour and a half to 2 hour session. But loads of comments in the text chat there as well. Sian, do you want to summarise some of the key things, and then we'll go into the discussion session?
Yeah, well, just a quick summary. I think there was a lot of empathy that people have also found that students and staff learners often think that everything's too long. So it's not just in this particular instance. There was also, feedback that this is lots of positive feedback about this is once you've done this once. Jed said it's done for effort. It's an active exercise that has use for a long time. So that was some of the feedback and certainly. I mean, we use Xerte and Banga. I definitely take this idea of using the kind of the X API tools that you use there to get the engagement in some of our staff development stuff. So there was lots of positive feedback, and people didn't want the presentation to end. so
Yeah.
Thanks, Clara and Zach. Deal. Thank you.
So we've got time now, unless Ron, do you want to do you want to respond briefly on the Xerte developer aspects, or do you want to unpick that like 2 o'clock onwards?
I can, it's probably more important to pick up questions from the group first, but yes, certainly. Okay. And I've got a page loaded where I can kind of very quickly unpick some of that and certainly explain the way that Xerte Analytics works in this way, but because I don't, there's screenshots, but people haven't seen
the full thing working.
Xerte.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that would be value. In fact, I think there may be value because that might answer some of the questions that people might otherwise. If you want to do a quick demo of that Xerte Analytic bit, and then we'll pick up other questions that haven't yet been responded to, or maybe are emerging from the other presentations as well. After that.
Very quickly, just a reminder: we've put the link in the text chat, but the link to that is to the page for today where you would have registered, and there's a panel here that we put at the for each running of the webinar. And this one, if you expand it, has the kind of summary of the session, some stuff about us, but then each of the speaker panes for the different guest speaker slots today, and the presentations are all linked there. And in the case of the presentation from Zach and Zara, that is the one that has the additional slides that we didn't get to see during the presentation, so the additional support information. I loaded up a dashboard for one Xerte resource that we use as part of the Xerte project, and this actually behind the scenes is just the one that is our page type demonstrator, so it's not learning content, but it gives you an idea. This is a resource with something like 80 odd different pages, and you can see here the number of users and the number of sessions are identical because this is used in anonymous mode, so the sessions and users are no different. This might kind of explain the the question about those differences, because the only way you can have accurate difference between the students and the sessions is if people are having to log in and so their credentials are being passed. Even if you're using it in anonymous mode, at least then you've got unique identifiers of who each interaction is. Whereas if you're using it in a group mode, then you don't get that. If I expand, there's one user here that's 38% complete with this result, and I've opened up the results just for that user, and you can see some of the pages they interacted with, but nearly everybody that views this resource is not completing it because it's not real learning content. They're just looking at the demonstrations of the page types that perhaps they're interested in. And if I open up the interaction overview across the whole thing, I mean, this is huge because there's like 80 odd pages. It's been live for years. And so in fact, the data struggles to cope with that because of that kind of match between the two. But you can see if I just very quickly scroll down, this is one learning object. So one learning resource, although it's a demonstrator, not learning content. And you can drill down into the aggregated responses across all of those. But as you say, you know, as you can see, we can look at the results from one session, and even more so, we can look at data from one interaction. So if I pop this up here, this is just a multiple choice question. And like I say, not everybody viewing this would have completed that. The good thing about this is there's no project or funding needed for people that have use of Xerte in their organization, take use of it. As soon as the install is connected to XAPI, then they can turn that on and they get these dashboards for any projects they're using it. You can also then share the dashboard as a resource back in the VLE if you're using one, and therefore the students can see their results and their dashboard, and the tutors can see the results and dashboard in the VLE rather than just in Xerte, which allows further collaboration.
Just by way of translation, do you want to just say XAPI and learning LR, what's it called, system?
Learning record store is,
yeah, that's it. Yeah,
typically the system that is needed to collect that data, and XAPI is a standard specification, if you like, that has the statements. People will have heard of SCORM. XAPI is much richer tracking of statements of interactivity, and Xerte uses a subset of what is relevant to the interactions and things that you can create in Xerte. I'll stop my sharing there because this session isn't specifically about that.
No, that's great, but that's really helpful, and I think that helps to underpin the kind of things that that Zach and Zara were talking about. Right. So, thank you. Are there any? So, Thea, thank you very much. We will, if we get any specific questions, we can send those on to you. Are there any other questions, Sian or Teresa or Ron, that we need to look at?
Yes.
Sorry, very quickly, the one thing we need to remind people, because I'm conscious we're near the formal end of the hour, is we do ask you to all put in the text chat what one thing you will take away from what you've seen today. Sorry, Sian, go on.
Sorry, yeah. I mean, there was one question that came up from Alison. How have the presenters so far managed the transparency of communicating about learning analytics to students without overwhelming them with data? So that was the question that came up, which is probably for everybody. I don't know if we've got time to answer that at the moment. But I don't know if anybody.
Happy to take this to start off. Yeah, it's a really important point, and that was why I commented that. We have a student-facing website where we explain roughly what goes on. We don't go into specifics around the parameters, just because I think it'll just start getting too confusing. We have had a few requests where we've had to provide our data, so that could even be from students, which is interesting. But we try and keep it a bit general. We do tell them that it's about how often they're engaging with their resources. We don't give too much detail on the sheer basis that they might start gamifying it if they want to avoid being spoken to by any personal tutors or by engagement officers. They may start logging in just so that they go green, because they know that makes them go green. So you have to navigate your way around that quite a lot. We've done quite a few focus groups as well around what kind of comms they would like. So we tend to put it in their induction at the start of term. So these comms go out at the beginning of term where we explain we are monitoring your attendance and we are looking at your engagement online and grades and stuff, but it's coming from a non-punitive aspect, and it's all about pastoral care, which is the feedback we've had from them is general. They don't really feel like it's big brothery. I know that there was a comment around that early on, as long as it's around pastoral care. But if it's starting to judge them and too predictive and things like that, they don't like that. So yeah, that's generally how we've approached that. But I can understand why that would be something you don't want to bombard them with data. Yeah.
I think from the OU's point of view, it is at the moment a major communication to the tutors, and we rely on the tutors then dealing with it, as Ethan's described, sensitively with the students.
Yeah.
So they obviously sign up to share their data, and we obviously say, we have your footprint and we use it to support your learning. And I think that's the point, that when I think there was a question in the chat, is all our interactions are with the intention of supporting them to complete and pass their module. And therefore for us, that is purely the benefit of the system, and as we've evidenced, and so we do share that evidence widely, and that's, again, we're on that journey with the student facing dashboard, because obviously you need to tailor the comms carefully for a dashboard for students so that what they're getting is going to actually help them progress. So that's the journey we're on now, to adapt the dashboard so that it can actually support them directly to progress in their studies.
That's something actually that City would really like to do in terms of student support. Just have a student-facing side of things, but it was a lot of work needed to be done on it in the short term. But it's something that we'd really like to do, and kind of using nudge theory around students seeing their own data and acting upon that. Yeah, exactly, and being able to make their decisions based on that themselves. Obviously, as you pointed out, you've got to be careful about what you show them. And we had some really interesting discussions with students around what they want to see. And generally, they don't want to see too much. Some students wanted to see where they sit in terms of cohort averages. Some didn't want to see that at all. Our mental health team were very reluctant about providing that sort of stuff. So we've held off on that, but it'd be interesting to actually have a conversation, Claire, about what's worked with you in terms of
that's what we're going through now. We're finding out what they want to see. So we've done some focus groups, and we've got a live test going on at the moment. So hopefully we'll be back later in the year, next year, to share what we found.
One of the things that we were looking at in the survey, in the Learning Analytics survey, we were looking at 4 aspects. We were asking people which of these 4 aspects they were most interested in: supporting teaching and learning, supporting management of resources and so on, or indeed policy, being able to check whether or not your EDI policies are working or your widening participation is working. The other one was direct student support, not so much in a teaching and learning point of view, but like disabled students, well-being, that sort of area. And then the final one was research. And what was very interesting is that, as we talked about in this session, there was this very strong emphasis on teaching, learning, student progression, and student well-being. I just wonder whether or not that's the only way in which the data is being used, or if there are other organizations, or even within your own organizations, people looking at the data from a different perspective to say, how are we as an organization meeting our policy commitments, or how are we as researchers applying ethical considerations effectively, or finding new ways of researching learning by using this data. Does anybody have any comments on that?
We should probably stop the recording at this point, Alistair.
Okay.
The formal bit, and then